Welcome. In this demonstration, we will look at how to draw tree silhouettes. So essentially, when the trees are seen from a far away distance, you see they're just their outline, and they can be very pleasing. Essentially, we will see how just using tree silhouettes we can draw a nice, pleasing landscape very quickly, very effectively. So let's start by again laying down different planes. So essentially when we want to show in a big distance in our drawing, it's always good to have different planes that recede and provide interest. So again, I will start by laying down this as my foreground plane. So this is the plane that is closest to the viewer. And what I will do again is to add a plane behind as the second plane. So this line stops right here. So essentially the order of these lines define the order of planes for us. I will go ahead and add another plane like this over here. So this is something that I just like to play with, so, and you can add different planes to your liking, and the way you do it is very simple. You essentially first draw the closest plane to the viewer. So this is the plane we drew, and then you start from any point and then draw a line, and the angle of the line will define. So this is the kind of this line defines this plane for us, and then I start from this point and then draw another plane behind it. So whenever the line of the plane intersects and stops, then that plane is considered behind the plane where it is intersecting and stopping. So this plane is behind this one because this line stops right here. What I will also do is to add one more plane at the very distance as this one. So essentially the plane that intersects all the other lines in plane lines in the front is the one that is furthest out. So this is that plane for us right there. And what we will do essentially is, once we have defined these, receding planes, we will draw some tree silhouettes on these planes, and that will be a simple landscape that we will do for this demonstration. But you will see how those tree silhouettes really, add interest to the drawing and provide a nice pleasing landscape. So let's start by putting down our small tree trunks for the tree silhouettes. So again, when we are drawing tree silhouettes, they are far away because that's why they're seen just in their outline. So what we will do mostly is to focus on having tree silhouettes in this farthest out plane. And here I will put down few trunks over here, and these are all farther out in the distance. And then we will put one more tree silhouette over here. And if we want, we can add one more over here. For example, right here, but we don't want to add any trees closer to you can add, but that's not in this drawing we will not draw any close-up trees. So we'll just be focusing on this far out tree, and then we'll see how we can nicely draw their silhouette. So we can actually add one more tree trunk right here. So there we have it. So I added few tree trunks, and what we will now do is to essentially create their outline, a silhouette. The way we do it is to first by essentially texturing the trunk, and the simplest way to texture the trunk, a far out trunk, is to essentially provide this kind of tapered darkness. So because of small width of the trunk, we do not have space to provide that dark to light transition that we have seen in some other demonstrations to bring out the roundness of the trunk. So what we do for these trunks is simply to add this kind of jagged darkness. So this kind of jagged darkness gives a feel for the roundness, kind of curvature, because the dark and the light together they give an illusion of roundness. So we want to have that feeling for our trunk. So that's what I will do. So I will go ahead and add that kind of jagged darkness to this trunk. And next, to define the silhouette, what we will do is essentially to draw the branches using this tapered line. So essentially, you draw a line like this, and then you add a bit more at one end to taper it. So that essentially defines a kind of a tree branch for a tree silhouette. So that's how easy it is. So that's what we will start doing here. So I draw a line like this, then I will draw a bit, and then I will add some more. So initially I'm just adding the lines, and then I'll go back and darken them to define the taper form. So I simply first initially create this kind of branch structure for this tree like this. And once you are happy with it, and maybe I can balance the tree a bit over here by adding like this. So now I'm happy with the kind of the overall outline that I've drawn. What I will do is to add a bit of taper over here by adding a bit more darkness to one end, to essentially make it feel that it's a tapering branch. So essentially always remember that the trunk and the branches they always taper. So once you define their outline using the line, then you have to go back and kind of just add a bit more at one end. So that's what I'm doing over here to to essentially define the taper that makes them more believable. So like this, and there we have it, and I can add a bit more line. So essentially once you have this, just you can play around and add a bit more line, and essentially create a nice simple silhouette, a kind of a winter tree silhouette over here for the tree. So we will actually not add leaves. In some other demonstration, I will show how to add, leaves to these tree silhouettes. But for now, we will just draw this simple, bare tree silhouettes, and that will be the kind of, focus of this demonstration. So I'll just add in a few more branches. And at the end, you just simply add a line. So as you progress and you're reaching the outer area of the tree, you simply want to show those dense, twigs or lines, and just add these lines like that. So that's what I will do, and always try to keep it interesting. So don't add it in any fixed pattern like this, but add bit here, but and add a bit over there, and kind of keep it interesting. So there we have it. We just quickly drew a silhouette, using these lines, tapering lines for the branches, and this kind of shading for the trunk. And essentially at the end, we just use these kind of simple lines to indicate the twigs and the thin branches at the very end. So, and if you want, you can actually add a bit more of these, because they always provide interest. So just add a bit more like this, make it a bit dense, and then there we have a nice tree silhouette. So that's how easy it is. And we will do the same for our other trees as well. So let's start with this tree over here. And again, for the trunk, I simply use a jagged darkness over here. I'm just darkening one end, and I'm leaving a bit of white in the center. So as you can see over here, there's a slight sliver of white in the center. And that white is very important, because that actually brings out the form. So if I totally darken it, it will look a dark spot, and it doesn't have that kind of curvature feel to it. So it's always good to leave a sliver of white over there to bring out the roundness. And then I will go ahead and define its silhouette, as we did before. Something like this. And again, this is something you can play with, so there is no fixed rules, except that make it interesting, make it balanced, and make sure that you provide taper at the end. So right now when we look at this doesn't look like tree trunks, because there is no taper. But so what I do is, again, once I have at least the main trunks, I add a bit of taper here, so the trunks are thicker at the point of attachment to the trunk. So I just go ahead and add a bit of taper over there, and I'll do the same over here. So essentially, wherever the trunk is attached to the trunk, make them a bit darker, add a bit more dark to create the taper, and then I can add more of these small twigs like this. So essentially, this is something fun to do. You can just evolve it, and you can just kind of add some more branches at the end to give it more interest like this. So I'm just adding those lines. So there we have it. And I'm trying to avoid any kind of uniformity, right? So I'm just trying to add a bit line here, a bit line there. So there we have it in a second tree silhouette we just did. And we will go ahead and do it for the farthest out tree, and this will be the smallest. So I'll just add a bit over here, and then I will just make it very simple, like 2 or maybe 3 main branches over there. And then I'll again darken it to give it a feel for branch, so that it is tapered, and then simply add some line. And again, when you're adding the line, you don't really have to always start and end from a branch. What I do here is just simply add line here, line there, and they're not necessarily starting from a branch, but our eyes interpret them as kind of part of an overall tree silhouette. So that's what you can do. So simply add some lines here, there, and make it interesting. And then in the end, the feel is that of a tree silhouette. So there we have it. Very quickly I just put together a tree silhouette. And if I want, I can add very simple lines at the end to give it a bit more dense feel, right? So that's something that depends on your interest. You can make a bit bare trees that are thin on branches, or you can make trees that have a bit more of denser branch structure like this. And I will do the same for this tree as well. Again, I simply add some initial lines like this, and then I add a bit of taper to actually give them a feel for the main branch. So essentially, when you're drawing a tree silhouette, you need to have some main branches that are coming from the trunk, and then once you have that, then you simply add these other lines to kind of give it a more denser feel. So these are the end twigs that you see in bare trees, from where the new foliage, those things come out. So there we have it. And then if you want, you can actually even just add some dots like this over here to give it a bit more interest over there. So I add a bit of just kind of dots to indicate some kind of darkness. So this essentially indicates that there are thick branches, so this is a darker spot. And then as go out towards the end of the tree, it becomes lighter because the branches are thin, and there is more white visible. So that also adds interest. So there we have it. A second tree silhouette we just drew. Sorry, the fourth one. And then we will add one more tree silhouette over for this one as well. And the same same principle. You just initially draw these main branch lines, And then you essentially define, draw a taper to give them a feel for the branch and not just some line. And once you have that, then you can essentially start to just add some more lines like this over here to find those secondary thin branches and twigs on that tree. So there, I'm just adding again, keep it random, just keep your hand moving and add bit here, bit there, and soon you will start to see the kind of the shape of a tree silhouette start to appear. And then I have it, right? So this is done as well. And again, if you want, you can add a bit more just simple lines at the edge to give it a bit more denser feel. And finally, I will draw one more for this one over here. Over here again, same principle, just draw some initial lines representing the main dividing branches and then darken their edge close to the trunk to give it a feel of tapering so that they look like branches. And then you add these small lines to those branches, and again, they don't really have to intersect. Like I said, you just draw one here, one there, something like this, so as long as there are some kind of these lines in different directions, they give a nice feel of a tree silhouette in the end. So that's what I'm doing. I'm not literally starting and ending these small twigs or small branches from the main branches, something like this. Just try to keep it random so that they're organized in different ways and gives a nice feel. And you can even use different shapes, right? So you can one tree silhouette can be in this shape, other can be a bit more something like this. So again, I've tried to make it this little bit longer. This is a little bit more elliptical. So you can use different shapes as well. And there we have it. This is how quickly we put down these tree silhouettes. And what we will next do is to ground these tree trunks by using this simple grass stroke that we have seen in other demonstrations. You simply use this kind of small grass stroke and make the bottom of the trunks a bit darker to ground them. So essentially, to ground a trunk, you simply make the bottom darker, but do not just use this kind of darkness, because that defines a rigid darkness that doesn't look nice. So use this kind of very small grass stroke kind of thing, and they indicate that there's something on the ground, a bit darker at the base of the trunk that grounds it. So that's what I will do. So I simply use this kind of grass stroke, and I will go ahead and use the same for all other trunks to ground them as well. So there, so simply by using this simple grass stroke and making the base of the trunks a bit darker with this stroke, they feel as if they're grounded and that there is some grass or some other kind of ground cover around that area. So essentially, by defining a ground cover, this strokes and defines the ground cover in the form of a grass or something like that near the base of the trunk, and that gives an appearance of that trunk as grounded. So I've done that. And what we can do also now is to essentially define our plane lines in the end. So I will go ahead and this is my the closest plane to the viewer. This is my second plane. And as you can see, again, because this plane line ends here, this gives an indication of this plane is behind this foreground plane. So this, the way the lines are drawn and the way they intersect and stop essentially establishes the order of the plane. And what I will do next is to draw this line. So now you can see why it's good to have the initial plane lines in dotted, because this helps us show the trunk through the plane line. So the plane line is not visible between the trunks, so we have to always make it dotted. So once we have done our composition of drawing trees and other elements, then in the end, then we can make these lines a bit darker to establish the proper planes. There we have it. So essentially, so again, this indicates that this is the foreground, the closest plane to the viewer. This plane is behind it. This plane is further behind it, and this plane, because this line ends here and here, is behind this plane and this plane. So it establishes this plane as the furthest out. So there, we quickly drew these plane lines to to have a proper definition for the planes, and then we did the tree trunk and the tree silhouette for some bare winter trees over here. And what I will do is to draw some kind of background. So right now it just looks a bit bare, and the easiest thing to do is to draw a distant tree line, and we do it by using these parallel vertical lines. So these parallel vertical lines are used in a lot of different contexts in pen and ink drawing. They do a lot of different purpose, and depending on where you place them and how you use them, they convey different feel. So over here, because we have trees, when we use them over here, they will convey a kind of a distant tree line. These parallel lines are used in many different ways, and essentially when used against a backdrop of trees, they indicate that there is some kind of distant tree line behind as well. So that's what I will do over here. I will just use this distant these parallel lines. And what I like to do is to stop these distant tree lines in a kind of taper manner, so that that gives a nice feel. So that's what I just did. So as you can see, just by adding this, these parallel lines, now it gives a feel of some kind of tree line behind these bare trees. So that gives a nice place for eyes to stop, right? So I always try to always put some kind of backdrop, a distant foliage or this distant tree line in my drawings. So there we have it. And if you want, we can add the same to this plane as well, right? So we can use this same kind of parallel lines to draw a second distant tree line for this plane as well. And you can do the same for this, or you can use any other element, for example, right? So but we will just leave it for now. So there we have it, a very nice landscape, a simple pleasing landscape we did, that has bare winter trees in their silhouettes and a distant tree line. And what we will do in the end is to essentially define the ground form and cover this with some kind of ground cover, because otherwise this white just doesn't at least to me doesn't look that appealing. It defines the ground form, but there's no coverage with any ground cover, so they look a bit kind of empty. So the first thing that we do to define the ground form is to use these lines to essentially define their ground form. So what I will do is to use these kind of angular lines. So the planes that are kind of at an angle, I like to use these lines at an angle to define the ground form. But for this front plane, we can simply use this kind of lines. And what I also do is to change the size of the lines with distance. Essentially, as we go out, we increase the size. So that also helps us with the perspective. So for example, here, when you look at this plane and your eyes go and you see that the distance of this, the size of this line is decreasing with distance, it introduces the distance in our drawing. So we feel that this plane is stretching from here till here, and the reduction in the size of these ground lines helps us establish the notion of distance as well. And for this further out plane, I will again simply use these lines, small lines over here. And essentially what happens is when you draw these lines, they serve to establish the ground. So right now, for example, for this plane, this white doesn't really tell us, what the orientation of this plane is or anything of that kind. But the moment we add, a bit of lines for this plane like this, now it is helping us understand that the ground is oriented in this manner. So this is how easily you can add these lines to establish the ground plane. Or the ground form for the planes. And I will use the same over here, and I will use this kind of line to establish the ground form for those planes. And once we have the ground form defined, what we next do is to essentially cover it with something. So now we can see that the ground is defined, but it looks better to cover them with something, and the easiest way to cover them is with grass and some wildflowers. So that's what we will do in this demonstration. And the grass stroke is simply again this stroke, that we have seen in a few other demonstrations. These are slightly angular lines like this. So this is the basic grass stroke. So keep few things in mind. One, that the line is slightly angled, so these are not perpendicular lines. And then they define a clump like this. So I use few lines and and here the direction changes, right? So this kind of lines together, they define a clump of grass, and that's what we will use to give an indication of the ground as grass covered in our drawing. So I'll start over here and just essentially add a bit of grass using that stroke. And what I will also do is to change the size of my grass. So as I get closer to the viewer, I will use a bigger grass stroke. So over here, I'll just simply add a bit of grass. And again, if you want, you can also add stones and a lot of other elements to these planes. But for now, I think we will just cover them with simple grass. So there, I just use this simple stroke to indicate this ground as grass covered. We'll use the same very small grass stroke for the distant plane. So essentially what I am doing is to use this very small grass stroke like this for the distant plane, and for the planes that have been up close a bit, I am using a slightly bigger stroke like this. So that is again helping us convey the sense of distance in our drawing. So when I use a smaller stroke of the same element for far away plane, and then use a bigger a bit bigger size for the close-up plane, that tells the mind of the viewer that that there's a sense of distance in the landscape. And the sense of distance, a depth is kind of what is always most pleasing in a landscape, is when the viewer can travel the distance and essentially feel that that they can travel the distance, and that is what makes the drawing enjoyable. So here I just quickly use that grass stroke to cover that plane. And again, what I've done is to use a few of these strokes, essentially a few of clumps here, a few clumps there, to give a feel of that ground is grass covered. So I'm literally not defining this kind of stroke for every single place in the plane, but a few here, few there helps us convey the ground as grass covered. And I'll do the same over here. So for the furthest, this line, which is essentially the furthest out point of that plane visible, I'm using smaller grass strokes like this over here. And as I come closer towards the viewer, what I can do is I can use a bit bigger stroke like this, because again, we want to convey the feeling that as we are moving with the distance, we are using a bit bigger. So that's what I do over here. So the size of the grass over here is a bit bigger than the size over here. So try to do that in your drawing to again capture the sense of distance as well. So I do the same over here, and there we have it. Just by adding few of this grass strokes, I'm able to convey this ground as grass covered as well. And we will do the same for this plane as well over here. Again, simple, one clump here, one clump there, here, there, and there. So just by adding few clumps here and there, a ground appears as grass covered. And this is the most powerful point of pen and ink, is that you just simply use a stroke to convey a suggestion for something that you want the viewer to feel. So there we have it. The ground, the planes that are furthest out, they have a nice grass covered appearance. And I'll do the same for this plane. And what I will also do is to add some kind of wildflowers to give a bit more interest. So essentially, the planes that are further out, over here, the flowers might not be that visible because it's further out in distance. So if you're adding a small thing like a ground flower, it's always good to add them in the plane that is closest to you, because then you can draw them a bit bigger. But if I draw a flower bigger over here, that won't work, because our tree is this size, and then you have to have the flower in that proportion, so it will be barely visible. So it's always good to kind of draw the small things in the plane that is closest to the viewer, so you can have their size a bit bigger and the viewer can get a nice feel for it. So first I will just draw a bit of grass, and again here I'm using a bit bigger grass stroke. So the grass stroke, the size of grass stroke over here is a bit bigger than compared to here or here, because this plane is closest to the viewer. So simply by changing the size, I'm able to kind of add a bit more sense of the relative distance of these planes from the viewer. So again, I simply use the same grass stroke, draw some clumps of grass here, some clumps of grass there. So, and what I will do at the end, once I'm done with this grass, is to add some kind of small wildflowers to add some more interest. So there, I'm simply using the same stroke. And here, just by adding few grass stroke here and there, we get a nice feel of this ground as also having a kind of grass cover. And what I will do finally in the end is to essentially use this kind of shapes, and again in different shapes, but this is essentially a flower silhouette. You can think of it as a flower silhouette, so this is kind of ground flower, but I'll just use different shapes, something like this, to give an indication of there's some kind of flower on this plane. So that's what I will do, one here, one there, something like this, so again, always try to have kind of organic feel in your landscape. So what that means is that don't organize them in a line like this, so that is not organic, but something like this is organic, because there is no kind of fixed order to it, and that always looks more natural, looks more believable, and that I think is how things are in nature. So always try to avoid any pattern and just kind of have an organic feel. So that's what I'm doing here, and just adding flower here and flower there. And as you can see, just by adding a bit of dark spots, our minds starts to interpret this as wildflower, because that seems to be the most natural conclusion in the context of a ground covered with grass, is that there will be some of these flowers on there. And in the end, if you want, you can draw a bit of line at the bottom like this as well to give a feel of stem. But essentially what we are doing is indicating these are small flowers with small stems that are close to the ground. So this is kind of how you can easily draw a feel of wildflowers on the ground. So I'll add a bit more here, a bit more there. And you can also further, if you want, at the base of this bunch of wildflowers, you can have a bit more density of grass to bring out attention to it. So essentially what we do in pen and ink is to use the different density to add more contrast to a point. So any point in your drawing that has more darker spots catches attention. And that is how we make the viewer travel our scene. So for example, this little bit darker spot will make the viewer look at it, and they'll travel the scene. And what we will do here is also to make the ground of this ground wildflowers a bit darker. So now, once after I add a bit of grass over here, there's a bit of nicer appearance, and it looks like there's a nice patch of wildflowers over here. So so again, just draw these kind of elliptical darks to indicate the shape of flower. Use different sizes, and once you're done, then at the base you can again add a bit of grass, small grass, the same stroke that you use to ground the trees, you can use at the base of these flowers to kind of define a spot where there is that concentration of wildflowers. So there we have it, a nice simple landscape we drew in under 30 minutes. And at the last, as the last step, what we can do is also darken these kind of plain lines. So that also kind of, and we can even introduce this kind of, so essentially when you have something like this, is a bit of unevenness in the plain line, and that makes it gives some more interest. So you can do that as well over here, and then start a line like this, but darken it so that the planes are clearly visible and understood. So I just darken them a bit, and also leave the distant plane lighter. So you do not want to darken this most distant line, because again with distance it will be less visible. So I just leave that a light, this line light, and just darken other lines a bit to more have a more clearer indication of the different planes. So there we have it, a nice simple landscape where we initially drew these planes, receding planes, to establish the order, and then we saw how we can draw these tree silhouettes, added a distant tree line, and then finally covered the ground with the grass and wildflowers. Thanks, take care, bye-bye.